They will ask me, eventually, whether it could have ended differently, whether there was a turn we didn't take, a word we didn't say, a hand we could have extended across that table that might have changed the arithmetic of what followed. They will ask it carefully, the way people ask questions they already know the answer to, but want confirmed by someone who was in the room. I have stopped being generous with those people. I tell them the truth. No, there was no turn. The cartel made their calculation, and it was exact, by their own lights, and it produced exactly the outcome their logic was designed to prevent. That is not irony. That is what happens when you mistake a human's patience for a human ceiling. My name is Vel Ash. I held the rank of secondary envoy to the Parath Trade Cartel for 11 years, a posting I did not seek and could not refuse. Assigned by the Bureau of External Affairs in the second year of the Corridor Compact's provisional status. I was 34 when I arrived at Parath Station. I was 45 when I watched the fleet move through the dome. What happened between those two ages is what I am here to account for, and I will account for it precisely because the families of those who did not come home deserve precision more than they deserve comfort. Let me tell you first what the Parath Trade Cartel was, because the name flatters them slightly, and people make assumptions. They were not a government in any sense humans would recognize. They had no territory they administered, no population they governed, no judiciary, no charter of rights, no mechanism of accountability to any body outside their own membership. What they had was the Tassenvo lanes, 11 transit corridors connecting the inner habitation clusters of the Calthrin Reach to the outer, resource extraction zones. And they had held those lanes, by a combination of ancient agreement and sustained intimidation, for 600 years. Everything that moved through the Reach moved on Parath terms. Everything that mattered commercially, militarily, in terms of simple supply, it passed through a Parath toll gate. The cartel was not a government. It was a choke point that had grown a boardroom. There were 17 members on the directorate when I arrived. 14 of them I learned to read, eventually. Their tells, their alliances, their particular resentments, the things they wanted badly enough to negotiate, and the things they would protect at cost. 3 of them I never fully understood, and one of those 3 was Overseer Kalith Vorathsen, who sat at the head of the directorate table for the entire 11 years I was posted there, and who was, without question, the most dangerous individual I have ever negotiated against. I want to be careful about how I describe Kalith Vorathsen, because dangerous and malicious are not the same word, and I have worked too hard for accuracy in this account to blur them now. He was not malicious. He bore humans no particular hatred, held no ideological position about our fitness or unfitness for the galactic community. He was something harder to handle than malicious. He was a technician. He believed with the complete, settled calm of a person who has never been seriously wrong about anything consequential, that the universe operated according to a set of principles he had mastered, and that mastery of those principles made outcomes calculable. He had been right about that for 60 years. His calculation of the human question was precise and internally consistent. It was also, in one small but absolute way, incorrect. I will come to that. The other 13 directorate members deserve a word, because their individual characters shaped every negotiating session in ways that matter to the sequence of events I am describing. The cartel's directorate was not, in the formal sense, a body with fixed positions or party affiliations. Members were appointed by their respective trade syndicates, the major lane operators, the cargo guilds, the insurance and bonding houses that underwrote transit risk across the Reach. And their loyalty was to those syndicates' interests, not to any collective ideology. This made the directorate simultaneously easier and harder to read than a legislative body. Easier because every member's vote could be traced, eventually, to a syndicate's economic position on the matter at hand. Harder because the syndicate's economic positions shifted with the commercial weather, and the commercial weather in the Calthrin Reach changed on a cycle that bore no relationship to any political calendar Earth understood. What this meant in practice was that Vorathsen's 14-year dominance of the Directorate was not built on ideology or personal loyalty. It was built on a meticulous, continuous maintenance of the commercial conditions that made supporting him the rational choice for 12 or more syndicates at any given time. He did not rule through fear, though fear was available to him. He ruled through the provision of outcomes his members needed and could not produce as efficiently through any other configuration. When a syndicate's cargo insurance rates spiked because of a contested corridor designation, Vorathsen resolved the designation. When a guild's cargo bonding agreements were threatened by a new entrant's competitive pricing, the new entrant found their transit windows consistently delayed until the economics of their operation became unfavorable. He did not do these things clumsily. He did them precisely through instruments that were always technically legitimate, always deniable, always just within the tolerances of the Reach Agreement's oversight provisions. He had been doing this since before I was born, and he had never, in that time, encountered a negotiating counterpart who was building something he could not see. That was the thing about Dara Solen that I understood only gradually. The way you understand a deep water current only when you have been swimming against it for long enough to feel that the resistance is not random. She was not reactive. She did not respond to Vorathsen's moves. She anticipated the category of moves he would eventually make and built the response before the move arrived. She was not waiting for him to show his hand. She already knew the hand. She was waiting for the moment in the game when playing it would matter. I arrived at Parath Station in what their calendar marked as the 7th Accord season, which was a formal designation for the 6-month window in which the cartel's standing agreements with its licensed transit partners came up for review. Earth had held a provisional transit license through the Tassenvo lanes for 9 years before I arrived, enough to move survey vessels, long-haul freighters, and diplomatic couriers through the Reach without paying the full transit duty levied on unlicensed traffic. The provisional license was exactly that, provisional. It could be reviewed, adjusted, suspended. It had been reviewed twice and adjusted upward, and the Bureau of External Affairs had sent 3 different negotiating teams to push back against those adjustments. 2 of those teams had made progress. 1 had not come home. I am speaking of the Andrath incident, which is in the public record, and which I will not dwell on here except to note that the cartel's position, when pressed on it, was that the members of the Pellerin mission had suffered an accident in transit, that the cartel bore no liability, and that the Pellerin mission's families could apply for condolence compensation through the standard commercial casualty process. The Bureau had filed 14 formal protests. The cartel had acknowledged none of them. This was the environment I stepped into. These were the people across the table. I want to tell you about Dara Solen. Dara Solen had been Earth's senior envoy to the Parath Trade Cartel for 7 years before my posting. She was 53 years old when I arrived, with the kind of face that reads immediately as someone who has heard every version of every argument and found most of them wanting. She was not warm in the way that people who have made warmth part of their professional toolkit are warm. She was something better. She was exact. She remembered everything. She prepared everything. She had read every cartel agreement going back 400 years, had cross-referenced them against the transit records for the Tassenvo lanes, and had found, over 7 years of careful excavation, 17 places where the cartel's own standing terms contradicted the conditions they had unilaterally imposed on Earth's provisional license. 17 places where, if you pushed in precisely the right way and cited precisely the right clause, they were required, by their own instruments, to either justify or retract. She had not pushed on any of them. I understood why, within 6 months of my arrival. The cartel could bear being wrong. What it could not bear was being made to look wrong. To press one of those 17 vulnerabilities in open session was to win a point and lose the room. And losing the room meant the provisional license came up for cancellation rather than review. Dara knew this. She had spent 7 years building the case, logging every inconsistency, every false citation, every procedural manipulation, not to use them, but to have them ready for the moment when the cartel's own conduct made their use unavoidable. She called that moment the crossover point. She explained it to me during my 3rd week in her office at the back of the Human Consulate Annex. A narrow room, one window, a shelf of physical binders that she maintained in parallel with the digital archive. She was standing at that shelf, running her thumb down the spine of a binder, and she said, "The crossover point is when holding back costs more than pushing through. Until that point, we document and we wait. After it, we use what we have. The measure is the provisional license. If the license is in jeopardy, the crossover point has been reached." I asked her how close she thought we were. She took the binder off the shelf and set it on the desk and did not open it. She said, "I have been watching Overseer Vorath Sen for 7 years. He is precise and he does not waste motions. For the last 18 months, he has been consolidating his majority on the directorate, which he does not need for the routine license review, and which means he is preparing for something that requires more than a simple majority vote. I do not know yet what it is. When I know, we will know how close we are." She put the binder back. The conversation was over. 6 weeks later, she found out what it was. The cartel had applied for reclassification of 3 Tassenvo corridor segments under a provision of the original Reach Agreement called the Sovereignty Preservation Clause, which allowed a licensed lane operator to designate certain transit routes as restricted to licensed partners of a higher tier than Earth's. Provisional status. If the reclassification was approved, which required only the cartel's own directorate to vote on it, as the Reach Agreement gave them that authority, 3 of the 11 corridors Earth used would become inaccessible under our existing license. We would need a full transit partnership agreement to access them. A full transit partnership agreement required a 10-year negotiation minimum, a schedule of fees the Bureau's financial models estimated at 12 times our current duty level, and a formal renunciation of any prior commercial claims, which was their mechanism for burying the Pellerin incident permanently. This was the crossover point. Dara told me on a Tuesday, in the same narrow office with the same shelf of binders. She was standing at the window this time. She said, "They've applied for the clause. We will receive official notification within the week. After notification, we have 30 days to formally contest or accept." I said, "Can we contest?" She said, "Yes. We have 4 valid grounds under the Reach Agreement. The cartel knows this. The question is whether they believe we will use them." I said, "Will we?" She did not turn from the window. She said, "I have spent 7 years building toward the moment we use what we have. Vorath Sen knows I have been building towards something. He is not careless. What he does not know is precisely what. That gap is what we work with." The official notification arrived that Thursday. We had 30 days. What followed was the most technically dense period of my professional life, and I will spare you most of it, because the mechanics of Reach Agreement arbitration procedure are of interest primarily to people who have never tried to live through them. The short version: Dara filed the formal contest within the required window, citing all 4 grounds. The cartel responded with a procedural challenge to 2 of the 4 grounds, which moved the matter into a directorate mediation session that was scheduled for the last week of the 30-day window. The mediation session was not, in any meaningful sense, mediation. It was a structured opportunity for the cartel to hear Earth's objections and overrule them. Dara knew this. She had attended 3 of them in prior years on smaller matters. She came to the mediation session with everything, every binder, every citation, every cross-reference she had compiled over 7 years. She did not use most of it. She used precisely what was needed to make one argument. The Sovereignty Preservation Clause, as the cartel was applying it, required a showing of good faith transit disruption risk that the cartel had not and could not make, because Earth's transit record through the affected corridors was 17 years of clean compliance without a single documented incident. To apply the clause without that showing was not within the cartel's authority under the Reach Agreement, regardless of what a directorate vote produced. It was a correct argument. It was also an argument the cartel had anticipated, because Overseer Vorathsen had, at some point in the preceding months, quietly reclassified a navigational report from 12 years ago and inserted it into the traffic registry as a documented disruption incident involving an Earth survey vessel. The incident had not occurred. The report had been manufactured. Dara found it 4 days before the mediation session. I know because she told me in the corridor outside the document archives, holding a physical printout, and the expression on her face was not surprise. It was the expression of a person whose long calculation has just been confirmed. She said, "He's invented an incident. He's fabricated a disruption event, backdated it 12 years, and inserted it into the traffic registry." I said, "Can we prove it's fabricated?" She said, "Yes. It will take the mediation session plus a formal appeal to the Reach Agreement Arbitration Board, which takes 14 months. In the interim, the clause reclassification stands provisionally. The 3 corridors are restricted, and our supply lines to the outer survey stations take a significant hit," I said. "So we prove it at the mediation session and demand the registry be corrected," she said. "Or we don't prove it at the mediation session," I said. "I don't follow." She turned the printout over so I couldn't see it and looked at me steadily and said, "Vorathsen has shown me what kind of operation this is. A negotiator who fabricates evidence has already decided he is not negotiating. He is managing an outcome. If I prove the fabrication at the mediation session, he will accept the correction, agree to withdraw the clause application, and begin working on the next instrument. And I will have shown him everything I have. Every document, every cross-reference, 17 years of careful archive work. He is a technician. He will study it, find its limits, and design around them. If I do not show him everything, he will not know what else I have." She slid the printout into her briefcase. She said, "I know where everything in that registry came from and when. I have had a parallel archive running for 6 years. He does not know about it. That archive is the only thing that still surprises him." I understood what she meant, though it took me longer to fully feel the weight of it. 6 years. She had been building a parallel record for 6 years. Not because she knew the crossover point was coming on a particular schedule, but because she understood the kind of operation she was dealing with. And she understood that operations like this do not reveal themselves in pieces. You can use until you have built the context that makes those pieces legible. Every falsified document makes sense only in relation to the pattern of falsification. Every procedural maneuver is only visible as a maneuver when you can set it beside all the other maneuvers. She was building not a case but a map, and the map had to be complete before it was worth unfolding. What Vorathsen did not know, what he could not know, because nothing in 60 years of operating in the Calthrin Reach had taught him to look for it, was that the human across his table had a different relationship to patience than anyone he had ever faced. He had measured human patience by the 3 prior negotiating teams. 2 of them had made progress, 1 had not come home. What he had concluded from that history was that human patience was a function of human leverage, and that human leverage was bounded by the instruments Earth had available to it. A provisional license holder has limited instruments. He was correct about the instruments. He was wrong about what she was building with the time his confidence was giving her. We went into the mediation session the next week. Dara contested on 3 of her 4 grounds. She did not raise the fabricated incident. She made the good faith showing argument clearly and precisely, knowing the directorate would override it, which they did by 11 votes to 6. The clause reclassification was upheld, 3 corridors restricted. The mediation was over. We walked out of the chamber afterward, and I waited until we were in the corridor and said, "What now?" she said. "Now we file the formal appeal to the arbitration board, and we wait 14 months, I said. "And in 14 months?" she said. "In 14 months we win the appeal. the registry is corrected, and the clause reclassification is reversed. And while we wait, Vorth Sen will look at what I showed him at the mediation session, and he will conclude that he now knows what I have, that I have 3 grounds and a clean transit record and a procedural argument. He will feel at that point that the position is manageable. That is exactly what I need him to feel. She was right about the appeal. 14 months later, the arbitration board ruled in Earth's favor on 2 of the 3 grounds. The fabricated registry entry was exposed in the board's own investigation. They found the original report, compared the insertion date, and flagged it as a post hoc modification. The clause reclassification was reversed. The 3 corridors reopened. The cartel paid a nominal fine under the Reach Agreement sanctions schedule and accepted the ruling without appeal. Overseer Vorth Sen expressed no public reaction. In private session with his directorate, which we knew about through our own monitoring, he described the outcome as a predictable cost of an initial positioning effort and expressed confidence that the next sequence would be more durable. He had learned everything from the mediation session that Dara intended him to learn. He believed he understood the limits of what she had. He was wrong, but he did not know he was wrong, and that gap, that specific, carefully maintained gap, was the thing she had been protecting for 6 years. 22 months after the appeal ruling, Overseer Vorth Sen convened a special session of the Directorate and moved to revoke Earth's provisional transit license entirely. Not restrict, not adjust, revoke. The grounds cited were procedural. Earth's Bureau of External Affairs had, in the cartel's assessment, violated the terms of good faith engagement under the Reach Agreement by pursuing the formal appeal rather than accepting the mediation outcome. This was not a valid interpretation of the Reach Agreement. Everyone in the room knew it was not a valid interpretation. It did not matter. A revocation required a 2/3 directorate vote. Vorth Sen had 17 members and needed 12, and he had spent the 11 months since the appeal ruling assembling those 12. The vote was scheduled for the 72nd day of the trade season. We had been notified 48 hours before. I will tell you what our options were, because I want you to understand that we understood them. We could request a delay of the vote, citing insufficient notice. The cartel's procedural rules required a minimum of 10 days' notice for special session agenda items, and we had 48 hours. A delay request was valid. It would grant us 10 days, and at the end of 10 days the vote would proceed, and the outcome would be the same, because Vorth Sen had his 12 votes and they were not going to move. We could file an emergency injunction with the arbitration board, citing the procedural violation of the good faith engagement clause. The board might grant it. The process would take 6 to 9 months. In the interim, the provisional license remained, which was something, but we had been in arbitration processes before, and the cartel had learned to manage around them. We could negotiate. We could approach directorate members individually, find the least committed of the 12, and offer something that moved them. We had tried a version of this when the clause reclassification was first proposed. We had moved 1 vote. We needed 4. Or we could let the vote happen. I need to explain what Dara said when those options were laid out, because it matters precisely. She was sitting at the head of the consulate table. There were 7 of us, me, 2 junior aides, the consulate's legal attaché, our transit liaison, and 2 staff members from the Bureau's regional office who had come in for the emergency session. Dara had her briefcase on the table in front of her, closed. She listened to the options as the legal attaché walked through them and said nothing until he was finished. Then she said, "How long has Vorth Sen believed he knows what I have?" The legal attaché looked at me. I said, "Since the mediation session." 2 years, she said, "and in 2 years he has not revised that belief." I said, "No. His internal communications suggest he considers the position well mapped." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then he does not know about the parallel archive." I said, "No," she said. "Then the vote proceeds on schedule." Dara, she said. "He believes he knows the ceiling of what we can do. Let him reach for it." When he finds what is actually there, he will not have another move. No one spoke. She opened the briefcase, took out a single document, and slid it to the transit liaison. She said, "This is the transmission protocol. When I tell you, you send this to the archive designation, not before." The transit liaison looked at the document. His face did not change. He nodded. She closed the briefcase and stood up. She said, "I want a full legal file prepared. Every document, every cross-reference. The original transit records, the fabricated registry entry, and the board's own finding that it was fabricated. Every communication we have from the directorate's internal channels. Everything. Formatted, indexed, stamped, ready to transmit." The legal attaché said, "Transmit to whom?" She said, "Every licensed transit partner in the Envoy network, every independent operator, the Reach Agreement Arbitration Board, the 3 species delegations on the Reach Observer Commission, and the Bureau of External Affairs." She paused. She said, "And every press outlet with credentials in the Calthrin Reach." The room was quiet. She said, "Send it the moment the vote carries." She picked up the briefcase. She said, "I'll see you at the session." The directorate convened at noon, 3 days later. The chamber was the cartel's main assembly hall, a long oval room with a raised central dais, tiered seating for the 17 directorate members in a full sweep around the oval, and a broad observation gallery at the rear that held, on this occasion, approximately 40 observers, licensed transit partners, accredited journalists, and staff from 3 different alien delegations with interests in Reach Transit. The dome above the assembly hall was one of the cartel's architectural signatures, a full span of cleared composite arching 40 meters overhead, with the Perith orbital lanes visible through it in daylight. On a clear session day, you could see freighter traffic. The human delegation sat at the visitors' table below the dais. Dara Solen in the center seat, me on her left, a junior aide on her right. 2 more staff members were positioned in the observation gallery. Dara had her briefcase. I had nothing in my hands. I had been in this chamber dozens of times over 11 years. I knew its acoustics, the way sound carried from the raised dais to the visitors' table with a slight delay, so that a long statement from a senior directorate member arrived at your ears a fraction of a second after it left their mouths, just enough that you were always slightly behind the sentence, always catching up. I knew the arrangement of the tiered seating, which placed the overseer at the apex and the 2 most recently appointed directorate members at the far ends of the oval, so that the geometry of the room expressed hierarchy before anyone said a word. I knew the quality of the light through the dome, how it shifted through the session as the orbital lanes brought craft between the dome and the primary star, dimming and brightening in intervals that you learned over time to treat as background noise. I noticed that morning that I could not read the chamber the way I normally could. Something in the quality of Dara's stillness had transferred itself to me, and I found that I was watching the session the way you watch a recording of something that has already happened, detached, almost, from the stakes I knew were present. I recognized this sensation from the mediation session 2 years prior. It was what she produced in people who were close to her when she was at the crossover point, a calm that was not exactly confidence and was not exactly peace, but was something like the understanding that the calculation had already been run. Overseer Voreth Sen opened the session with the procedural recitations that preceded all special votes, the quorum confirmation, the agenda statement, the formal reading of the motion. His voice was the same as it had always been in 11 years of watching him, even, unhurried, precise, a technician reading a conclusion that had already been calculated. He did not look at us during the reading. He did not need to. The outcome was settled. The motion was read. The question was called. The vote went around the table. I counted 13. They needed 12. Voreth Sen called the tally and stated it aloud. 13 in favor, 4 opposed. The motion carried. The provisional transit license granted to Earth's Bureau of External Affairs was hereby revoked, effective the close of the current trade season, with a 90-day wind-down period for vessels in transit. Any Earth-flagged traffic in the Tassenville lanes beyond that wind-down period would be subject to the full unlicensed traffic levy, plus an administrative penalty. He set down the vote record. There was a moment, just a moment, where the room was still. 40 observers who had come to watch a political execution staying quiet as the body registered what it had just seen. Then Dara turned her head and looked at the transit liaison in the gallery. He was already moving. She turned back, folded her hands on the table, and waited. I have thought in the years since about what Overseer Vorath Sen read in her face in that interval. He was watching her. He had been watching her throughout the session, the way a technician watches a system he is about to shut down, looking for stress indicators, for the signs that his calculation was landing correctly. What he saw, I think, was nothing, not blankness, not suppressed distress, just a woman with folded hands, waiting for something to happen that she already knew was going to happen. He would have noted that. It would have begun to recalibrate something. The transmission went out 11 minutes after the vote. I know the 11 minutes precisely because the cartel's own monitoring systems logged the outbound data packet from our consulate's transmission relay and flagged it for review. The review took 4 hours. By the time anyone in the directorate understood what had been sent, it had already reached 23 recipients across the Calthrin Reach, including 4 arbitration board members who had certified the ruling against the cartel's fabricated registry entry 2 years prior. The archive was everything Dara had said it was. 6 years of parallel documentation, organized and indexed by someone who had spent 11 years learning to anticipate exactly what a cartel directorate would need to see in order to understand that it had committed, over a documented period, 17 procedural violations of the Reach Agreement, 4 acts of evidence fabrication, 1 incident of unlawful detention, which was the Pellerin mission, finally named and sourced and documented, and a pattern of coordinated market interference designed to prevent independent transit operators from developing competitive alternatives to the Sassenvote toll structure. It was not a complaint. It was not a filing. It was a record, clean and exact, with every citation intact, every document original, every timestamp verified. It was the kind of document that once received cannot be unreceived. Once the arbitration board has it, it is in the board's file. Once the Observer Commission has it, it is before the Commission. Once the press has it, it is published. Vorath Sen understood this within the hour. No, because his chief of staff sent a communication to our consulate flagged as urgent and addressed to Senior Envoy Dara Solen, requesting an emergency consultation. I was in the consulate when it arrived. Dara read it. She sent back 2 words, "Not today." In the hours that followed, I watched through the consulate monitors as the cartel's inner offices entered a state that I would describe, in diplomatic terms, as non-functional. The directorate was convened in emergency session 3 times. The legal division was working against multiple simultaneous crises. Vorath Sen's communications, and we had access to more of his communications than he knew, showed a man doing what precise technicians do when a system fails in a way their model did not predict, not panicking, but recalculating with furious speed, looking for the instrument that would correct the deviation. There was no instrument. That was the thing Dara had understood and he had not. A revocation of Earth's transit license was a lever the cartel could pull once. Once pulled, it either produced compliance or it produced what we had sent. There was no intermediate state. There was no negotiating position available to a body that had just fabricated evidence, concealed an unlawful detention, and manipulated its transit registry and been documented doing all of it. The moment the vote carried, the only thing between them and a full arbitration board proceeding, which had teeth under the Reach Agreement, including the suspension of the cartel's own lane operation off authority pending investigation, was Earth's willingness to treat the outcome as negotiable. Dara had made clear it was not. Vorath Sen's second communication at the 4th hour. It was addressed to me, not to Dara. It requested a meeting in 2 hours at the cartel's offices at overseer level. I brought it to Dara. She read it. Right back. Tell him we'll meet tomorrow at 9 at the consulate, I said. He's asking for 2 hours. He's in a difficult position, she said. I know he is. Tomorrow at 9, he came. He came with his legal director and 2 of his senior directorate members to our table in our narrow consulate annex and sat across from Dara Solen, who had a cup of tea she had not touched and no documents visible anywhere. He said, "You have created a situation that neither party benefits from pursuing." She said nothing. He said, "The archive you transmitted contains materials that were obtained through monitoring of Directorate internal communications, which is a violation of the station's diplomatic protocol." She said nothing. He said, "I am prepared to offer a restoration of the provisional license at the prior terms, and a formal acknowledgement that the revocation motion was procedurally irregular in exchange for a mutual agreement to withdraw the transmitted materials from the public record and cease further transmission." She said, "The materials are already in the record. I cannot withdraw what the board has received. I cannot withdraw what the Observer Commission has received. I cannot withdraw what has been published," he said. "The spirit of the offer, the Pellerin mission. I want an accounting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Pellerin incident is a commercial casualty matter under the standing protocol." She said, "No. It is a matter of unlawful detention resulting in the deaths of 7 Bureau personnel, documented in the archive, and it will be heard by the arbitration board under the Reach Agreement's enforcement provisions. The question before you is not whether that proceeding occurs. It will occur. The question is whether you go into it having cooperated with the process or having obstructed it. Those produce different outcomes under the sanctions schedule." She picked up her tea. She drank it. She set it down. She said, "I'd like your answer within the week." He left. I want to tell you what I thought, sitting in that room after he was gone, because it matters to what comes next. I thought, we have won. The archive is out. The board will proceed. The cartel cannot suppress a board proceeding under the Reach Agreement without triggering the suspension of their own lane authority, which is the one thing they cannot survive as an institution. They will cooperate eventually, or they will be dissolved. Either outcome is a human win. We have arrived at the crossover point and pushed through it, and the mathematics have resolved in our favor. The 11 years, the careful documentation, the patience that Dara had maintained through 3 license adjustments, and a fabricated registry, and a mediation session she deliberately lost. It was all here, it was all paid. I thought, it is over. I was wrong. Not about the archive, not about the board, not about Vorathsen's eventual capitulation, which came 31 days later in a formal submission to the arbitration board that acknowledged the Pellerin detention, paid the assessed penalties, and agreed to a supervised audit of the Tassenvo registry going back 20 years. I was wrong about something smaller and more immediate. I thought the morning Vorathsen came to our table was the end. It was not. There was still one piece of what came next that I had not foreseen, and I had not foreseen it because nothing in 11 years of working the cartel had prepared me for the kind of move it represented. I will tell you about the morning of the transit season close. Under the terms of the revocation motion, which was still technically on the Directorate's books, pending the board's formal suspension of it, the wind-down period for Earth flag traffic was 90 days from the vote. Vorathsen's formal submission to the board came in at 31 days, which meant 59 days of wind-down period remained. During those 59 days, the cartel was legally required to permit Earth flag transit to continue under the revoked license's terms. They were not happy about it. Their compliance with the transit management protocols became, in those 59 days, significantly less smooth than it had been. Inspection delays, documentation requirements that had not previously been applied, equipment faults in corridor junction stations that caused transit windows to slip by hours. None of it rose to the level of a Reach Agreement violation. All of it was precisely calibrated to stay below that threshold. It was Vorth Sen's signature. Exact pressure, administered within the rules, designed to communicate that the channel, though formally open, would cost more than it was worth. Dara documented every instance and said nothing. On the 39th day of the wind-down period, an Earth-flagged courier vessel called the Marith Transit, a small, fast diplomatic runner, the kind of vessel that moved time-sensitive materials between bureau offices, entered Corridor 7 of the Tassenvol lanes on a standard transit schedule and failed to emerge from the corridor junction at its expected time. The junction station reported a navigational anomaly. The corridor transit log showed the vessel entering. There was no subsequent log entry for its emergence. I was in the consulate when the report came in. Dara was at her desk. She read the report and sat still for a long moment and then said, "Who was the crew?" The Marith Transit carried 4, the pilot, a co-pilot, and 2 diplomatic couriers transporting sealed materials from the Bureau's regional office to the Outer Survey Coordination Station. We had their names. Dara read them. She set the report down on the desk. She said, "Get me a corridor transit log pull for Corridor 7 for the last 30 days, and get me the junction station's maintenance records for the same period." I want to describe what the next 4 hours were like in the consulate, because I think it matters to the record. We did not panic. I want to be precise about that. We were afraid, in the way that people with training and responsibility are afraid, which is a state that exists alongside function rather than replacing it. The Marith Transit crew were not friends of mine, in the sense of people I had socialized with. They were colleagues. 2 of the couriers had worked with our annex before. One of them I had shared a transit vessel with on a bureau run 3 months earlier. The pilot I knew only by name from the manifest, 4 people, in a corridor, in a junction station that had logged 15 maintenance events in 30 days. Dara did not speak much during those 4 hours. She read the incoming data as it arrived, cross-referenced it against the records I pulled, and built a picture that she did not share aloud, but whose outline I could see from the side. The pattern of junction delays in the preceding weeks, the timing of the anomaly relative to the wind-down period, the correspondence between the maintenance event clustering and the periods of heaviest, Earth-flagged traffic through Corridor 7. It was not accidental. It had the structure of an operation calibrated, as everything the cartel did was calibrated, to stay below the threshold of a provable reach agreement violation. But 4 people were missing, and that changed the calculus in a way that Vorth Sen may not have fully modeled. I have read, in the years since, various academic analyses of why the cartel made the decision they made in Corridor 7. Several of them argue that it was a miscalculation, that Vorth Sen had assessed the detention of bureau couriers as a manageable pressure instrument, equivalent in kind to the junction delays and documentation requirements he had been applying throughout the wind-down period, and had underestimated the qualitative difference between operational friction and the physical detention of human personnel. This is probably correct as far as it goes, but I think it misses something. Vorth Sen's model of human escalation was built on the 3 prior negotiating teams. One had not come home, and the cartel's response to that incident, the Pellerin mission, had been a claim of accidental casualty, a commercial condolence process, 14 unanswered protests. The Bureau had not escalated beyond formal protests. The Bureau had not matched the detention of its people with a corresponding act. From Vorth Sen's position, the model suggested that detaining 4 more Bureau personnel would produce approximately the same response. Formal protests, a board filing, more negotiation. He had seen the ceiling of what the Bureau did when its people did not come home. Or he thought he had. He had not seen Dara Sen decide 11 years in that the crossover point had been reached. It took 4 hours. What came back confirmed what she already knew. The junction station in Corridor 7 had logged 15 maintenance events in 30 days. Standard navigational anomalies, equipment faults, the kind of record that a body paying careful attention to staying below the reach agreement threshold would produce. The corridor transit log showed 2 other vessels that had experienced brief delays in the same junction in the past 2 weeks, both of which had eventually emerged without incident. The Marith transit had not emerged. We raised the cartel's transit operations office at the 6th hour. Their response was logged, and I have it verbatim. The anomaly was under investigation. The junction station had been taken offline for emergency maintenance, and the cartel's transit operations team was working to restore normal transit function in Corridor 7. An update would be provided within 48 hours. Dara read the response. She said, "Get me Vorthsen. His office said he was unavailable." I went back 3 times. On the 3rd attempt, at the 9th hour after the Marith transit's disappearance, I was told that the overseer was in an extended directorate session and would be available the following morning. Dara was quiet for a long time after that. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and stayed there for perhaps a minute. When she turned back, she said, "Send the signal." I said, "Which signal?" She said, "The Bureau knows the signal. Send it." I want to be precise here, because there has been speculation about what the signal was, what it authorized, and when it had been prepared. I can speak to what I know and what I observed. I know that Dara Solen had, at some point prior to our posting together, developed with the Bureau of External Affairs a contingency protocol for a specific category of event. I know this because I had seen a single reference to the protocol in a Bureau routing document 3 years into my posting, and I had asked Dara about it, and she had said, "It is for a category of event we have not reached and may never reach. Do not reference it in your logs." I had not referenced it in my logs. The signal went out on the consulate's secure bureau relay. It was 94 characters. I did not read it. I did not need to. What it produced 6 hours later, at the beginning of Parath Station's morning cycle, was visible through the dome. There is a particular quality to the light that comes through a composite dome when there are large objects between the station and its primary star. The dome's transparency is calibrated to the station's standard illumination schedule, and when that illumination is interrupted by mass, the ambient light in the chamber below changes. It darkens incrementally in a way that is felt before it is consciously registered. People in the chamber notice it without knowing what they are noticing. They look up. I was in the directorate's outer hall at the time, waiting for the morning session at which Vorthsen had agreed, finally, to see us. There were perhaps 30 people in the outer hall, directorate staff, transit representatives, clerks, 2 journalists who had been covering the board proceedings. They all looked up at approximately the same moment. The fleet was not configured for combat. I want to be clear about that, because the word fleet carries implications that the configuration did not support. What had come through the Tassenvo lanes, not Corridor 7, the 3 corridors that had been restricted under the clause reclassification and were still being disputed, but through Corridors 1, 2, and 9 under a legal transit instrument that the cartel had not revoked, was 47 vessels of varying classification, the largest of which was a Bureau of External Affairs transport carrier that had been reclassified 18 months prior under a construction category that did not appear in the cartel's traffic registry as a military vessel. It was, by the technical definitions used in the cartel's registry, a large commercial transport. It was also, by any practical definition, a warship. They were not moving in attack formation. They were parked, positioned in a configuration that orbital mechanics made technically required for vessels of their respective masses to maintain stable position relative to the station, and that happened to place them in a spread pattern with clear sight lines to every approach vector on Parath Station's inhabited ring. They had arrived during the station's night cycle. No one on the directorate's staff had flagged the transit logs. By the time the dome's morning light began to change, they had been there for 4 hours. I looked up with everyone else. Then I looked at Dara. She was watching the dome. Her expression was the same expression she had worn at the mediation session 2 years ago, when she had chosen not to reveal the fabricated registry evidence. Not blank, not suppressed, just settled. The expression of a person watching something she has already finished calculating. The doors to the directorate chamber opened and Vorath Sen's chief of staff appeared. He looked at the dome. He looked at Dara. He said something in the Parath administrative dialect that I will not translate because it was not intended for me, and because the translation would make him sound less composed than his face did. Dara said, "I believe the overseer is ready for us." We went in. The chamber was configured for a small session. Vorath Sen at the head of the dais table, 4 directorate members flanking him, the legal director at a side station. The dome was overhead. Through it, 47 vessels, the largest of which was close enough that you could, if you knew what you were looking for, distinguish its hull configuration from a standard transport. Vorath Sen looked at us as we entered. He looked at Dara. He did not look at the dome. He said, "This is an act of provocation." Dara sat down. She set her briefcase on the table. She said, "Those vessels are in legally licensed transit corridors. Their transit documents were filed with your operations office 48 hours ago and acknowledged at the time. They are not in violation of any instrument," he said. 48 hours ago, she said. "I filed them the morning after the Marith Transit's disappearance was reported. I would like an update on the status of the Marith Transit's crew." He was quiet, she said. "I would like it today." He looked at the members flanking him. One of them said something in the Parath administrative dialect, quietly. Vorath Sen turned back. He said, "There were operational difficulties. The crew of the Marith Transit sustained no fatalities. They are currently held at the Corridor 7 junction station in a temporary holding status pending resolution of the navigational anomaly." Vesper said, "Held," he said temporarily. She said, "Under what authority?" He was quiet again. She said, "I want them released by noon. I want them transported to Parath Station on a cartel vessel and delivered to the human consulate annex. I want their vessel and every document and material on board returned intact. And I want a formal written acknowledgement of the holding, signed by you, dated to the hour of their detention." She opened her briefcase. She took out a document and placed it on the table in front of her. She said, "This is an addendum to the board filing. It documents the Marith Transit's disappearance, the junction station maintenance history for the preceding 30 days, your office's initial response, and your declaration just now that the crew is held at the junction station. When I leave this room, I will transmit this addendum to the board. Unless the crew is delivered by noon, I will transmit a supplementary addendum documenting your failure to comply with this request. The board will receive it. So will the Observer Commission. So will the press." She pushed the document across the table toward him. She said, "I don't need anything else from you today." She waited. It was, I think, the longest silence I have sat through in a diplomatic setting. Vorath Sen looked at the document. He looked at the dome. He looked at Dara. He picked up the document. He said quietly to his legal director, "Begin the release process." The crew of the Marith Transit arrived at the consulate annex at 11:47. 4 people, all alive. One with a soft tissue injury from a corridor equipment malfunction that may or may not have been accidental. Dara met them at the door. She shook each hand. She did not say much. She took the sealed materials they were carrying and locked them in the consulate safe, and then sat with them for a while in the consulate common area and let them talk. I stood in the doorway of the common area and watched her listen to them and thought about the crossover point, about what it actually meant to reach it. The board proceedings concluded 14 months later. The cartel's lane operation authority was placed under supervised administration for a period of 3 years, with independent auditors from the Observer Commission reviewing all transit decisions. The Pellerin families received formal acknowledgement and a settlement that the Bureau's legal team called adequate and the family's own representatives called insufficient, which is probably both true. 3 directorate members resigned. Vorath Sen did not resign. He remained in his seat through the supervised administration period, and complied with every requirement. He was precise to the end. He did not provide more than he was required to provide, and he did not withhold what he was required to give. He was, in the structured context of a board-supervised process, an excellent cooperative subject. His calculation had shifted. Cooperation now produced the best available outcome. He cooperated. I never spoke with him again after that morning in the directorate chamber. Dara remained at the posting for another 2 years after the board proceedings concluded. She completed the negotiation of a full transit partnership agreement, not the one the cartel had used as a lever, not on their terms, but a renegotiated instrument that removed the sovereignty preservation clause entirely and established a fixed, audited fee schedule for the next 30 years. It was, by the assessment of every bureau analyst who reviewed it, the best transit agreement Earth had ever signed in the Calthrin Reach. On her last day at the posting, I walked with her to the transit dock. She had 2 bags in the briefcase. The briefcase was empty. I said the binders, she said archived. Everyone, I said. I have been trying to understand something for years, the parallel archive. You started it 6 years before the crossover point. You knew, 6 years before the vote, that the crossover point was coming. She said, no, I knew it might come. The archive was preparation, not prediction, I said, and if it never came. If Vorath Sen had been satisfied with the license adjustments and never moved to revoke. She thought about that for a moment, she said. Then I would have retired with a very thorough personal record of 11 years of trade diplomacy that no one ever needed to read. I said, that doesn't bother you? 6 years of work that might have produced nothing? She looked at me in the way she had always looked at me when she thought I was asking the wrong question. Not impatient, just waiting for me to catch up. She said, it produced something whether or not they ever moved. It produced a cartel that was negotiating with someone who held more than they could see. Everything I got from them in that 11 years was gotten from a position that was already stronger than they knew. That is not nothing. Her transport was called. She picked up her bags. She said, you'll do well here. She walked through the dock doors. I stood there for a moment and thought about 47 vessels parked in 3 transit corridors under perfectly filed documentation, waiting in a station's morning light. About a crew of 4, alive, delivered to our door at 11:47. About a document pushed across a table and a man who picked it up. About what it means to negotiate from a position you spent 6 years building and never revealed until the moment it was the only thing that would do. I have been asked since whether I would characterize what Dara Solen did as aggressive, as escalatory, as, in the language certain commentators prefer, a provocation. I characterize it as exact. She did not make a single move that was not within the terms of the instruments available to her. Every transmission was legal. Every vessel was in a licensed corridor under file documentation. Every document in the archive was real. The fabrication was theirs. The detention was theirs. The vote was theirs. She built a position that made their next move visible before they made it. And when they made it, she was already past it. They did not lose because she was stronger than they were. They lost because they made the mistake that precise technicians sometimes make when they have been right for a very long time. They mistook a mapped position for a complete picture. They thought they knew the ceiling. They reached for it. What was there was not what they expected. That is the whole of what I can tell you. I have told it as exactly as I know how. If anyone asks me whether it could have ended differently, I will tell them what I told you, no. But I will add one thing I have not said until now. The crossover point is not a line you cross when conditions force you to. It is a line you draw carefully over years, and then you wait for the other side to find it. Dara Solen drew that line on her first week at the posting. Vorath Sen found it 11 years later. That is the whole distance between them in the end. Not strength, not firepower, not the fleet through the dome. Just a woman who knew, from the very beginning, exactly where the line was.